Be'ez Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Menachos Daf Membeis. A lot of different halachas to cover, and we will start from Daf Membeis Amud Aleph. Tana Rabbanan, about 1, 2, 3, 7 lines from the top. Tana Rabbanan. Let me get this bigger. Hi, Lewis. We just began, and we are 7 lines from the top of Membeis Amud Aleph. Tana Rabbanan. The Torah tells you here, Membeis Amud Aleph, Torah Rabbanan, tzitzis. Torah tells you have to make tzitzis. What is tzitzis? Tzitzis means ain't tzitzis ela anaf. Tzitzis means strings. The strings are called the anaf. Gedil is the knots and the windings, but anaf is the strings. How do you know? How do you know tzitzis means strings? Because it says, it's a part of a nevuah of Yecheskel. He took me b'tzitzis roishi, with the strings of my head. The Abaya said, make sure that your strings don't get tangled. V'tzarach lefroida, you have to separate them. You have to constantly run your fingers so that keep them separate. Ki tzitzusid armoi, like the hair of a goy, that are connected on the bottom, but they're stringy on the top, right? So therefore, same thing that that's why you have to keep you got to make sure that your tzitzis don't get tangled. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, hitel ala keren oya halagdil kshera. If you put the tzitzis very close to the corner, so if we have a picture, and I'm going to make the tzitzis, let's say you put the tzitzis like right on the corner, no good, right? That is no good. Or al gdil. Gdil is like the stripping at the end. Let's say the stripping at the end, they had like a thicker piece of thread across the corner, and you lean the tzitzis mamish on the corner. According to the Tanakama, it's kashera. Rabbi Eliezer Biyankov paisel b'shtei. Rabbi Eliezer says that's too close to the corner, and it would be pasul. Now, and that's probably the way we pass it. We pass it like that. It has to be a little above the corner. Kaman Ozva Hoda Amar Rav Gidol Marav. Rav Gidol Marav gave a reasoning. Who is Rav Gidol Marav explaining? He's explaining basically Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because it says tzitzis shrichosh tehei noitefes ala karen, should be hanging over the corner. Shenema, the pasuk says al, on top of kanfei vigdeam, on top of your corner. So it has to be hanging above the corner, not directly on the corner. So therefore, as you see, the circle where they put the tzitzis in is much higher than the corner. So therefore, who is Rav explaining? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the reason of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. So now, how far off the corner does it have to be? Rabbi Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, V'tzorach sheyarchik b'loi kesher gudol. It has to be away from the corner, a thumb joint. Let's take a look at the picture. You see the thumb joint? The guy has a thumb joint over here. So that's how far. You see the dotted line? That's how far off the corner it must be. Now, but we learned yesterday that the corner is 3 fingers away from 3 fingers away from each side. So that's the answer. The tzitzis has to be located not too close, but not too far from the corner. More than a thumb joint, but less than 3 finger breadths away. And that's where they put the hole over here, right over here. They put the hole there. That's what the Gemara is going to say. It's Rav Papa, it's Rabbi Yaakov. I need Rav Papa and need Rabbi Yaakov. Rav Papa, if you just have Rav Papa, have a mina, I would have thought, Toich Gimel, the loy larchik tvei. The Toich Gimel, the loy larchik kei. Rav Papa said that you shouldn't put it 3 fingers breadths away. I would think that, okay, you can't put it too far, but common karav ma'ali, but as more closer you are to the corner, I would think that it's good. It's Rabbi Yaakov. That's what Rabbi Yaakov told me, that you have to be a thumb joint away from the corner. Even the Rabbi Yaakov, if you learned just Rabbi Yaakov, I would think, maloi kesha goydel, just be a thumb joint away, the loy lekarvei tvei, don't get too close. But bekama derachaka ma'ale, as long as it's, if you're far away from the corner, that should be good. Tzricha. That's why 2 different rabbis gave different shiurim. One rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov, gave the shiur that you have to be a thumb joint away. And one rabbi said you have to be 3 fingers breadths away. That's the answer. You have to be within the thumb joint, but not more than 3 finger breadths away, because then it's too far from the corner. That's not a corner. But you can't be too close, because the Torah says al kanfei v'gdam. It has to be on top of the corner. That's why it's exactly where they put the circle over there. Says the Gemara. Ravina originally came from Eretz Yisrael, and he moved to Bavel. So Ravina and Rav Sama, Haviyatsu Kamid Ravashi. Ravina and Rav Sama were sitting in front of Ravashi, and they were talking to each other. Ravina saw something about Rav Sama that disturbed him. Chazina Rav Sama, Ravina saw Rav Sama, Lekarnin de Glimi, he saw his tzitzis, the Ravina, I'm sorry, Chazina Rav Sama. Rav Sama saw something about Ravina. He saw that Ravina's tzitzis was the sasa vatzim like kesha gaidol, and that it ripped. It's interesting, it's not, we think you could just go buy new tzitzis from this farm store, but it wasn't so easy in the time of the Gemara. So Rav Sama saw Ravina's tzitzis, and that it ripped all the way till the corner. And he didn't change his tzitzis. So now the tzitzis were like somewhere here, That's where it was. There was like a rip, and the tzitzis were coming out from there. So he says to Ravina, you got a puzzle of tzitzis. Don't you, Ravina, hold like Rav Yaakov that has to be a thumb joint away from the corner. So Ravina said, no, b'shas asiyah itma. When you're making the tzitzis, that the original hole has to be there. But if it rips, but when I made the tzitzis, it was kosher, so it still remains kosher. Ichsif. So Rav Sama was embarrassed. He didn't know that he tried to correct Ravina, and Ravina retorted back that you're wrong. I'm right. Amalei Ravashi. Ravashi says, Loi tiskef lach, don't be disturbed by that. Chad v'nayin ketrei minam. One of them is better than 2 of us. In other words, Ravashi and Rav Sama said, we're both from Bavel. And Ravina, who is a much wiser rabbi, he's from Eretz Yisrael. So a rabbi from Eretz Yisrael is worth like 2 of us. In other words, they had much wider yediyas in Eretz Yisrael, and they knew exactly what the halacha is. That the halacha was that yes, when you originally make it, it has to be a thumb joint away from the corner. But if it eventually rips and gets to the corner, it's still the tzitzis will be kosher. Says the Gemara, another inyan. Ravacha bar Yankiv Rami Arba, Vayas le Me'af, Umaya le Beglimi, Vavik le Mevik. Ravavcha, he would take 4 strings. Now we make 4. The way we do it is what? We stick 4 strings through the hole, and now you have 8. Rav Acha bar Yaakov would bend the 4 strings right away into 8 strings, and then stick it through the hole, and then would loop it. So if you want to see the picture of that, it's right here. I'm going to make it a little larger. Here you go. Now, first he stuck in 8 strings here. You see it's still looped over here. He bent 4 strings and made it 8 strings and stuck it through the hole. And then he slip knotted it, the tzitzis this way. That's how he put on his tzitzis. Of course, that's not the way we do it. Rav Yirmiyah Medifta, no, Ksavar, Rav Acha held, being in Tamanya Beglima. When you're putting it into the hole, it has to be 8 already. Ke'echad will have a gedil and b'mokam psil. So by the psil, by the knots and the windings, already has to be 8 when you're sticking it through the hole. That's what Rav Acha held. Rav Yirmiyah Diftia Ramani Tamanya, he actually used 8 strings. The inner shitza, he had 16 strings, but he didn't slip knot it. Again, because both Rav Yirmiyah and Rav Acha held that when the Torah tells you need 8 strings, it's when you put it into the hole, it should be 8 strings. So Rav Yirmiyah actually put 8 strings in the hole. Rav Yaakov bent the 4 strings into 8 strings and then put it through the hole. But we do things different. Mar Ravina of a Kedidam. Mar Ravina does it like we did. We stick 4 strings in and it becomes 8 strings. You don't have to, when you stick it through the hole, make it 8 strings. Now the Gemara talks about the din of what about making a bracha when you make the tzitzis. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman Ashkechel Rav Adabar Ava. Rav Nachman found Rav Adabar Ava Rami Chuti v'Komavarach. Rav Nachman found Rav Ada bar Haba that he was, tying his tzitzis, making tzitzis for his garment, and he made a bracha, lasas tzitzis, baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, to make the tzitzis. So Rav Nachman made fun of him. My tzitzis shemane. What tzitzis? What bracha on tzitzi you're making? He made fun of the way he talked. In other words, Rav Nachman wanted to make clear that you're not supposed to make a bracha when you make the tzitzis, because Rav Nachman said, Rav said, tzitzis, when you make tzitzis, ain't tzricha bracha, you don't make a bracha. Kinach nafshe Rav Huna, when Rav Huna passed away, and Rav Huna was a student of Rav, so now there was no real Talmud of Rav to ask questions. All Rav Chizda l'mirmed Rav ad Rav. So Rav Chizda got up and he says, I have a contradiction of Rav to Rav. Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav that what? That you don't make a bracha on when you're making the tzitzis. Umi Amar Rav, tzitzis ain't tzarich bracha. Did Rav say that when you're making tzitzis, you don't have to make a bracha? Is that true? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav said, Menayin letzitzis begoy shri psula. First, the Rav is going to tell us that a goy is not allowed to make tzitzis. Shenema, Dabal Bnei Yisrael, the Osulem tzitzis, the Bnei Yisrael, they should make it tzitzis. God said that. Bnei Yisrael Yasa, only a Jew can make it tzitzis. Lo Yegoyim Yasa, and a goy can't make tzitzis. Fine. Now, if Rav said this statement that a Yid could only make it tzitzis and not a goy, but the Gemara is going to say like this. So what's your question? What's your stira of Rav? So Rav Yosef, Rav Chizda held that there's a rule. Since now that I know that Rav said that only a Yid can make tzitzis, but there's a general rule elsewhere called mitzvah kashera b'goy, b'Yisrael ein tzarich levarach. Any mitzvah that a goy can make, that a goy can manufacture, then a Jew doesn't make a bracha when he's manufacturing that. Call mitzvah shepsula b'goy, any mitzvah that's a goy is not permitted to manufacture, b'Yisrael tzarich levarach. A Yisrael should make a bracha. So the question is, since tzitzis, Rav said, is only a Jew can make the tzitzis and not a goy, since a Jew can only make the tzitzis and not a goy, so if so, why did Rav say when a Jew makes the tzitzis, he doesn't have to make a bracha? So basically, there's a rule that if a Jew does something, if only a Jew could do something, then you make a bracha. If a goy could do the same mitzvah, then you don't make a bracha. Says the Gemara, if the Gemara just asks right away on that rule, uklalihu, is that a general rule? Is that a proven rule? V'hal mila, the kshera b'goy, mila is kosher b'goy. Interesting. We think only you could get a Jew to be the moil. The truth is that you could use a goy to do the mila. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Yisrael, a city that has no Jewish doctor and nobody knows how to perform a milah, and you have a choice to use a goy that is a doctor or a kuti, a person who thinks he's Jewish but really serves as Avodah Zarah. He's like a kuti, a Kuthians. So Rav Meir says, let the goy do the milah, and don't let the kusi do the milah. Don't let the goy do the milah because goyim could kill the Jewish child. Use a kusi, even though he's probably going to, he might think, give the milah l'shem avodah zara. A goy doesn't do that. But bottom line is, Rameir holds a goy could be your moil. And nevertheless, when the goy is the moil, Yisrael tzarich levarach. When a Jew is the moil, you have to make a bracha. So you make a bracha on the milah. So how could you say that if a goy could do the same mitzvah, you don't make a bracha? Well, a goy could be a moil and a Jew could be a moil. And nevertheless, when the Jew is the moil, he makes the milah. He makes a bracha. So the Gemara says, you're right, but that's not a question against Rav. Me do the time El Rav. Your question is against Rav. Rav misl pasul. Rav holds a goy cannot be the moil, not like Rameir. Rav disagreed with Rameir. But we learned how do you know a mila by a goy is pasul? So the Gemara says, Rav said, because you should do the milah. That's basically what Hashem said to Avraham Avinu. People like you should be ones that should keep and do the Mila. Rabbi Yochanan, Hima Amal, we have another pasuk, Hima Yoma, Hamal Yuma, the ones that could do the Mila, gives the bris Mila. He's the one, but not a goy. So, okay, so fine. Therefore, you make a bracha. Nevertheless, where was Rav Chizda's question against Rav? Rav said, Rav Nachman's version of Rav is tzitzis doesn't need a bracha. Fine. Rav Chizda said, but a goy cannot do the tzitzis, cannot manufacture tzitzis. So according to Rav, if the general rule is if a mitzvah is only kosher by a yid, then you make a bracha. So why did Rav say that you make a bracha when you manufacture tzitzis? That's the question. So the Gemara says, Sukkah Masayale Tefillin Havet Yufta. A sukkah will prove me right, and tefillin will prove you wrong. For example, Hare Sukkah, a manufacturing sukkah. Who could put up a sukkah? The Ksheira B'goy. It's kosher if a goy puts up a sukkah. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Sukkah's Goyim, Sukkah's Nachshim, Sukkah's Behemoth, Sukkah's Kutiyim, Sukkah B'chol Mokoim, Ksheira. Any sukkah done by a goy, by a woman or an animal, it's kosher. Just make sure the sukkah abides by all the halachas of Hilchas Sukkah, that you're using appropriate schach. And yet, of Israel, when a Jew manufactures a sukkah, he doesn't make a bracha. I'm manufacturing a sukkah. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, if you're making your own sukkah, so then it's like you're manufacturing your own suit. So it doesn't matter. It's not specific bracha on the sukkah. You say, I like you manufactured your own car. You make a shechiyanu. But you don't ba leisha ba if you're going to use the sukkah. Then you say Baruch Atah Hashem leisha b'sukkah. The ilu, but lasei sukkah le'mavar. You don't make a bracha lasei sukkah. So the reason probably is that the reason why you don't make a bracha, I'm manufacturing a sukkah, because a Jew doesn't necessarily have to manufacture a sukkah. You could use a goy to manufacture a sukkah. So that's why you don't make the bracha. Okay. So that's a proof that that rule holds true. But tefillin tiyuftin. Tefillin will be a refutation to the rule, because you do make a bracha when you manufacture tefillin. By tefillin, the psul is b'goy. Tefillin, apostle, if a goy writes the tefillin, you don't make a bracha. The Tan Rav Chanina bar Rava the Parsha, now we go to Amud Beis, Sefer Torah, tefillin, umezuzas, Shekasran min kusiagei avid isha v'katem the Yisrael b'shumit. Any converted Jew, a goy who writes the safras of a tefillin, so he's manufacturing the tefillin. Pesulim, they're apostle, they're not good tefillins. Shnema ukshartem b'ksavtem. That means kol sheyesh m'ksira. If a person is chuyev to put on tefillin, yesh m'ksiva, then he can write a tefillin. And for example, a woman, she's not mechuyev in tefillin, she cannot write a tefillin. So a goy cannot write a tefillin. So it's only a Jew could write a tefillin. And uvi Yisrael ein tzarich levarach. And yet, since it could only be manufactured by a Jew, so l'chayra, you should make a bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem, that you commanded us to make tefillin. And yet we don't find that bracha. Ein tzarich levarach. You don't make such a bracha. The shalach Rav Chibur and Rav Kuna, which made Rav Yochanan, only when you're putting on the tefillin. Al tefillin shel yad, omer baruch Hashem mitzvah tefillin tefillin. Al tefillin shel roish, omer baruch Hashem mitzvah tefillin al mitzvahs tefillin. Ve'ilu lasas tefillin loy mevarach. You don't make. So you don't make a bracha. So again, what we're trying to find out over here is, when will I make a bracha to do something, to manufacture a mitzvah? By tefillin, you don't make that bracha. Okay, by sukkah, you don't make that bracha because a guy could manufacture a sukkah. A guy could build your sukkah. Tefillin, but only a Jew could write a tefillin, yet you don't make a bracha. So why it's so tzitzis? Maybe that's why by tzitzis you don't make a bracha. You don't make a bracha by tzitzis because a guy cannot be manufacturing tzitzis. But there must be a rule. The Gemara is trying to find the rule, is when do you make a bracha that you have the schus to manufacture a mitzvah? Elav hainatam. This is the bottom line reason. Kol mitzvah, dasiyos and gemar mitzvah. When you're doing it, when you're manufacturing the mitzvah, that is the mitzvah. Kigoy mila. What is mila? Mila is when you give a cut, that's the mila. So afagav the ksher b'goy, even though a goy could do it, Yisrael tzarich levarach. When a Jew does it, he makes a bracha, because that is the gemar mitzvah. The whole mitzvah is the asiyos lav gemar mitzvah. Any mitzvah that what you're doing is the preparation of a mitzvah. You're manufacturing so somebody else could do a mitzvah, could go in tefillin. Afagav the psulas b'goy, even though a goy can't make tefillin, Yisrael einim tzarich levarach. A yid doesn't make a bracha on tefillin, because on manufacturing tefillin, because that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is not to manufacture tefillin. The mitzvah is to wear the tefillin. Okay, now with tzitzis balkam mipalgate. By tzitzis, that was the machlekes between Rav Nachman and Rav Chizda. Mar Sava, Rav Chizda held choives talasu. When you manufacture a garment of four corners, and then you put tzitzis in. So when you put the tzitzis in, you mekayim a mitzvah. Why? You didn't put it on, but Rav Chizda held that even if, and we saw this opinion earlier, that even if you have tzitzis in your four-cornered garment in your closet that you'll never wear, you have a chiyuv to put tzitzis on it, because it's an obligation on the garment. And therefore, when you put the tzitzis in, that is the mitzvah, even if you're not going to wear it. So as soon as you put the tzitzis in the garment, you're makayim a mitzvah. That's why Rav Chizda held you should make a bracha when I'm tying the tzitzis into the garment. Umar Sava, but Rav Nachman held chayvus gavrahu. When you're the guy that's manufacturing, tying the tzitzis into the garment, that's an obligation on the individual. When you're going to wear that tzitzis, then you make a bracha al mitzvahs tzitzis, but you're not going to make a bracha last tzitzis to tie tzitzis on a garment, because that's not the mitzvah according to Rav Nachman. Amalei Rav Mordechai Rav Mordechai said, Rav Ashi, Aten hochimas law. You had a question because you had an opinion of what Rav said of that general rule, because you held that Rav held that a goy cannot make tzitzis, and therefore you have a question. Why don't we make a bracha? I had a version that Rav even was matter a goy to tie the tzitzis, so you could hire Chinese people to tie the tzitzis into the corners, because Shnema Dabel B'nai Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, Vasu Lahem tzitzis, that they should make for themselves tzitzis. Yasu Lahem Acherim, somebody else can make the tzitzis, and goyim can make the tzitzis. So therefore, now you have your question doesn't even begin, because since the manufacturing of the tzitzis can be done by a goy, so no one ever thinks that you could make you have to make a bracha when you're making the tzitzis. Says the Gemara, new piece of Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Asan min koitzim min animim min garadim pesula. Okay, here's the picture. If you make the tzitzis from the following material, right over here, you make it from you didn't attach tzitzis. You made a garment and you had extra strings at the thorns, extra thorns at the end, or from the strings that hang down after you finish weaving, or from little threads that come out of the stitching. And you said, okay, now I have threads there, let them be my tzitzis. That's no good. It's puzzle. But if you're going to make it from susya is a swatch of thread, and then you cut it, and then you put it into the bag, and that's kosher. So that's what he says. Awesome, because you're supposed to attach tzitzis to your garment, not make the garment and just leave extra strings. But minas susin. But if you're going to use a swatch of thread of yarn, ksheira, then it's kosher. But ki amrisa kamei de Shmuel, when I said from Shmuel, Amar, he said af min asusim pesula. Even if you're going to use a yarn, a swatch of wool, it's still going to be possible. Why? And this is what in the video you can see it. Be'in and tviyah lishma. You have to spin it lishma, and therefore you can't just take any spun thread and use it for your tzitzis. Somebody has to, when he was spinning it, He has to spin it and say, I'm doing it l'shem mitzvah tzitzis, like you do by matzah. Kitanoi. If you cover, let's say you make the boxes of tefillin out of gold, or you use the hide of a wild animal, a tummy animal, psulas, because you could only use tzitzis, you could only make the boxes of tefillin when it's made from something that you could eat. Or behema tahira ksheris, but if you use the hide of a kosher animal, it's kosher. Even though when you made the hide, you didn't say I'm making it l'shem mitzvah tefillin. But Rab Shimon ben Gamliel oima af or behema tahira psulas ad sheyabedem l'shma. Even if you're using the hide of a kosher animal, the guy making the box out of the hide, and working it out to make it leather, he had to say, I'm doing it l'shem to make mitzvahs tefillin. So same thing over here. When you're spinning the tzitzis, according to Shmuel held, like Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, that even when you're spinning the tzitzis, you have to say, I'm doing it l'shem, that these threads, after spun, they're going to be used for tzitzis. So it's not enough just to put it into the beged l'shma. You have to, when you're making the thread, manufacturing the thread, it has to be l'shma. Finally, another minute, we'll stop. The Gemara deals with another question. Amalei Abaye Rab Shmuel bar Yehuda. Abaye said to Rab Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda, "Hai techel tehei savisale." How do we make the chelis? How do we color it? So it's not enough to make the dye, right? Even if you make the dye, you need to put chemicals in so that when you stick the wool in there, the dye will stick to the wool. So by sin and dam chilazon, you get the blood of the snail, let's call it, with samonim, and you put other chemicals, ramina lebiyarin, you throw it into a pot, umatarchin lane, you heat it up. Now you have to test it out. V'shaklida porta bebeyasa. You take a little bit of the dye and you put it into an eggshell, okay, and then you test it. V'tamina lebeudra. And then you test it with a piece of wool to see if the dye will connect to the piece of wool. And if it does, then you know the recipe is ready. So what do you do with the extra dye in the egg? And what do you do with that piece of wool? So the Rav Baya said to Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda told Abaya, so you throw out the egg with the extra dye in there, and you burn the piece of wool. So now that's interesting. Why wouldn't you take, the wool? So shmamina tlas, you see three things from there. Shmamina te'ima psula, shmamina debina tzvila shma. That if you're testing something, it's no good. In other words, the wool that you're going to stick to be used as tzitzis has to be, when you're saying I'm dipping the wool into the dye, you have to say I'm doing it l'shem mitzvah tzitzis, not doing it l'shem for the sake of testing to see if the dye will stick to the wool. You have to doing it l'shem mitzvahs tzitzis. Ushmamina, and you see another interesting thing is te'ima pasla. Once you use the dye once, you can't use it again. In other words, there was leftover dye in that eggshell. Why don't you spill it back into the pot? The answer is, since this dye was used already as a testing agent, so now you can't reuse it again. The dye, you can't reuse the leftover of that dye to dye your tzitzis. It won't be kosher. So therefore, we don't spill it back into the pot because then it will passel all the dye. So that's what the Gemara says. Haini tima psula, haini tzvila shma. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? There's two things. You see that testing passels it, the wool, and you need tzvila lishma. You have to dye it lishma. Amar Vashi, that's what the Bryce means. Matam kama matam tima psulo. Why is this piece of wool passel? Because you just used it for testing. And because once you're using it to test, but not l'shem tzitzis, that passels the whole wool. Now, ketanoi, but it's a machlekes tanoim. If once you use the dye, can you reuse it again? Te'ima pesula. Once you use the dye as a testing, as to test, then you can't reuse it. Mishum shenema kalil techeles. In this week's parsha, it says that one of the clothing of the me'il was kalil techeles, made out of totally wool, totally dyed wool, dyed blue. So it means the first attempt to use this dye was to dye the clothing, the me'il of the Kohen Gadol, the cloak of the Kohen Gadol. So fine. That's what Rab Chanina ben Gamliel says. Even if you're going to use it a second time, it'll still be kosher. You could use it sheni a second time. So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Devai, let's say I have a pot of dye and I used to test to see a piece of wool to see if it works. I could still now use that same dye in the pot for tzitzis, even though this is going to be the second time I'm using the dye. It'd still be good. But according to Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel, it would be no good. And according to Ray, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda told Abaya, he said that it won't be good because he went with the opinion of Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel. Okay, so ends Daf Mem Beis. Okay.
Thank you.
A lot there.